And welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage, and you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. Today, my guest is Claus Raasted. Claus is an extremely eclectic and interesting gentleman. He is the co-founder and director of the College of Extraordinary Experiences. By some, that's been called the Harvard of Experience Design, which is pretty cool. He's a senior advisor at McKinsey. He is a consultant, a coach, and an advisor. He has his name on, I think, over a dozen books, hundreds of blogs, hundreds of podcasts. Obviously, pretty creative, and I think the creative endeavor he's most proud of is probably his young daughter. But thanks for coming on board today, Klaus.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that illustrious intro.
So let's sort of dive in here. So you've got your hands in lots and lots of different things, and there's a connective tissue underneath each of those to the content and your thinking and all those sort of things. So maybe work backwards a little bit, because I don't think you woke up one day and said, today I'm going to found a college, because most people don't do that. So how did the content lead you to ultimately developing the College of Extraordinary Experiences?
So I have a background in live action role playing, and that is dressing up in costume and pretending to be somebody else. And for some people, it's running around in the woods pretending to be Lord of the Rings and whacking each other with latex swords. And for others, it's an 80s drama about heartache and music and rock and roll and anything in between. So this immersive experiences, interactive experiences, extraordinary learning experiences has been my thing since I was 16.
Okay.
And for many years, I've been doing this professionally in one form or another. And since some people would call it a weakness, I'd usually call it a strength, is that I'm not a perfectionist. It means that I get stuff done. So the articles, the podcast, the 28 books, all that sort of stuff, I have a tendency to produce content at an alarming rate. And since it adds up, then at some point it looks like a body of work, I guess.
Got it. So let's go back to that for a moment. So oftentimes, lots of people produce content. I love that you said at an alarming rate. That's kind of cool. That could be a blessing and a curse. And what I mean by that is, lots of reasons people do produce content. There's creativity, there's the intrinsic motivation, there's curiosity, there's whatever. But oftentimes people are or not putting out, but just creating lots and lots and lots of content. At what point do you decide, okay, I'm going to put this out there, and here's the strategy, and here's the plan, and here's the objective? Because ultimately, it has to yield a return back to you, or you can't continue to just create stuff and put it out indefinitely.
So one of the things I've done to trick myself into actually doing stuff has been to have a very holistic view of things. So I said, if I do help a friend produce a political cookbook, which is a thing that happened, then some people will see, he's a great book producer, and that'll lead to something interesting. So I've always had the core of stuff I've done, which has been kind of my job or things related to my company, whatever that has been at the time. But then I've had a tendency to get better and better at the actual skill of production, which meant that when I heard somebody complaining at a party that we should do something like TED Talks just in Denmark, I wouldn't take more than 5 minutes before I said, okay, let's get it done. Episode 1, we're going to record on Thursday. Here's a film crew. Here's the web server we're going to use. Here's how we're going to market it to our crew. Let's go. Stop talking. And that, of course, has landed me in a lot of weird places where every time I got better at producing, I got better at producing. And then producing something seemed like a good option. I know it sounds a bit weird, but it's a little bit of do what you're good at and you'll get better at doing it.
Got it. At what point, so that's how you start going down a path, right? So you hear there's a need, let's do a TED Talk, something similar to TED Talk in Denmark. And then you have an ability to turn that into implementation execution. Because a lot of people, once they see you do that, a year later will say, I had that idea, right? And the idea with that execution, I thought of that. I've heard that a lot.
Oh, yes.
That's your starting point. At what point do you decide to sort of cut off the fuel to something? Because I think that's a key issue. Like, it's easy to ideate and create and hear things, but then it's not as easy to say, that TED Talk in Denmark thing, I'm just using that as an example. We tried it 5 or 6 times. Nobody really cares. Kind of a dumb idea. Let me move on to the next thing. How do you do that?
So that's a really good question. And I wish I could say that I was brilliant at that. Sadly, I'm not. That's part of my problem. But if there's terrible sound, it's because somebody just started drilling in the building.
Oh, cool. That'll be fun.
One of the things that I've done is that I've built a lot of stuff that can be handed off to other people. For example, the Danish TED Talk thing just passed its episode 30, and I haven't been involved in it for a couple of years. So one thing is building stuff that can be passed on. That's one of my reasons for not just being completely overloaded. And the second has also been that a lot of stuff I've done with other people.
Okay.
So either I've been the lead on it or I've been kind of the facilitator. So if one of the things I'm writing right now is co-writing a book about how to be a butler. And I'm not a butler, and I probably will never be, but I'm an experienced designer. So I take this guy who has a dream of butlering and introducing the concept of the modern Nordic butler, and I tell him, okay, here's how we're going to do it. And then I help him do it and get kind of get my name on the cover and produce half the work, so to speak. And then I move on to the next thing.
So it's interesting. So a lot of, and I want to push on this because it's a bit unusual, or not unusual, but different. Most creatives are not so good when it comes to developing a team, collaborating. The struggle is, oh, all these fireworks are going off in my brain, all these great ideas. So I go down this rabbit hole, and I go down this rabbit hole. Based on your experience, I wouldn't imagine that you'd be writing a book on butlering. But it's interesting the way that you describe that, because you could say, well, I woke up one day and decided I'm going to, sell the farm and go be a butler. But there's something intriguing about it. And you plus the person who's got the content expertise in that area together are more powerful than either of you alone. So how do you go about choosing who to collaborate with, and maybe more importantly, who not to?
Who to collaborate with is something that strikes my fancy. That's a good place to start. And the second is something where I feel it in some way adds to my total body of work, which is my expertise is in experience design and in extraordinary experiences. So if it's something that can be used in that field in some way, and to me, the idea of having a butler, especially a butler at a party, and kind of the whole concept of butlering is in the modern world, not a job, but an experience. So that to me fits pretty well. And the second is who not to collaborate with that's the hard part is I think to me that comes down to people who see that there's value to somebody who can go in, conceptualize, structure, tighten, and make things actually work, just like some of the work that you yourself do. That the people who see the value in that, I'll gladly work with them. But the people who are like, oh, so I'm going to do all the work and you just get to talk. Well, then I just tell them, thank you for a nice cup of coffee and have a good time. And usually they don't end up doing anything.
If you're enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about our podcast, please leave us a review and share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcast and on all major listening apps, as well as at thoughtleadershipleverage.com/podcasts. So give me an example of a project you started, put some time and energy and investment in, and then pulled the plug on because you realized there was no there. And you don't have to name names if you don't want to.
No. So in my previous incarnation as a live action role play guru, I had a podcast. And that podcast was essentially me picking up my phone and talking into the phone for anywhere between 3 minutes and half an hour on subjects I would find interesting.
Okay.
And I did 83 episodes of that. Then I had my business partner in one of the ventures who said, let's make it into videos. Let's make it structured. Let's make it different.
Okay.
I said, okay, let's do that. And then we did 20 episodes. And then I realized that it had become a bother because instead of doing something where it was very, very simple to take the next step, picking up a phone, hitting record, and starting talking, no editing and just uploading, it's very easy to produce the next bite of content, to kind of produce the next point of advance along the journey. And suddenly we changed it into something that required editing, and both of us had to be there, and we had to think a little about it. And I think to me, one of the key things I think calling it thought leadership is a bit grand on my end, but in content production and content distribution is to make every single step so small and so easy that it actually gets done.
Okay. So you're not overwhelmed by the production or the minutia or the technical challenges.
No, exactly. My own podcast, which I do right now, I'm lucky enough to have a producer so I just deliver a finished sound file and then he takes it from there. But even that, I always tell my guests that there's no editing. So if they sound like idiots or I do, it's just going to be part of the show. Not because we couldn't do editing, because of course we could, and we have experience, but because it means that suddenly a one-step process, which is record, send, is suddenly now a 2 or 3 step process. There's editing,
Right.
there's
Right.
reviewing, there's maybe a second edit, all that sort of circus. And I've found that, especially with my books and also with the other content I've done, that for me the trick is to get every particle down to its minimum, and then there's a bigger chance of getting somewhere.
So I want to pause, push on that for a little bit as well. So there's a continuum, right? On one end of the continuum, there's people that won't ship anything until it is ideal, until it is perfect, until it has been
Sure.
rubbed, scrubbed, polished, and every whatever. Those people don't tend to ship a lot, and I would argue that in some instances, the perfectionism is a hindrance and a maybe covers for insecurity, whatever the case may be, and they get less out, but whatever they get out is highly polished and all that. Then on the other end, there's just downright sloppy, right? So if you're writing a book, there is no excuse for grammatical errors or typos, right?
Sure.
It's deciding, and I love the way you framed it, like how many steps are necessary and what's the trade-off in the steps against the time versus quality. So again, in a podcast, you just made a little a comment a moment or two ago. Hey, there may be some background noise. I'm not sure if we're going to edit that out or not. Who knows, right?
Sure.
In your model, it would just appear there.
Yeah, I would never edit it out.
Right, because it's just a thing, and it's real. It happened. Oops, there was a noise. We're having a conversation, and you made a comment, etc. And others would have a different standard, but I think there's not one standard that's the right standard. But what is the right standard for that format at this point in time against what you're doing, right? So if this was your speaker reel or a TED talk, or you're pitching to a $1 zillion client, then the standards are pretty high.
Very true.
If it's content that you're putting out for the sake of putting it out, and again, typos, things like that, not excusable, but not as good as it could be, but gets the job done. I think that good enough thing is something folks struggle with. Would you concur?
I would jump up and down, wave my arms, and yell, "Yes, Peter, yes."
Well, I'll give you a moment to do that. No, I'm
Which
kidding.
is my way of
There you go.
concurring. And the second I would add is that, of course, this discussion of where are you on the spectrum of perfectionism versus sloppiness, but getting things out there. But there's a thing I'd add to that, and this is, of course, going to paint me in a nice light. So, of course, I'm the one bringing up the point, which is that every time you do something, podcast, article, video, speech, whatever it is, every time you do something, you gain a little bit of levels in it. If it was a computer game, just by finishing the book, you'd get more book writing skills. And the trick is that you, as the creator, you see potential. So let's imagine for a moment, in a gamified world, you are a level 56 book writer, and you can spend a couple of weeks on a book and it becomes a level 20 book. You can spend a couple of months on a book and it becomes a level 40 book. You can spend a couple of years on a book and it becomes a level 56 book, which is your maximum. And after that, it doesn't really matter. Now, if the audience can't perceive the difference between level 20 or level 40 because they're at level 10 readers, then whether you give them the 20 or the 40, or God forbid the 56, they're all going to see it as roughly the same.
Right.
Because to them, anything more than level 10 is mind blowing.
Okay. How do you know the delta between your level and your audience's level? Because, one could argue, well, you should meet the audience where they are at least a touch or two above to show your domain expertise and your professionalism, et cetera, right? So how do you know if the gap is too far and you're putting too much effort in relative to the caliber that the audience expects, or the objective of that piece of content? Is it just something to say, hey, look at me, become aware of me, and then come over here and look at more and look at more and look at more?
I think it's a complex equation that is not as easy to do as it is to talk about. But part of it is relentless and ruthless self-criticism,
Okay.
knowing your strengths and knowing your weaknesses. And number two, figuring out what resources do you have available. I mean, even I will say that if I spent a year on a book instead of a month, then of course it's going to be a better book. I mean, all things equal, it's going to be a better book. But do I have a year to spend? And if so, is it worth it? So a lot of it is it worth it? And for me, the place that I see it the most is that while I'm a decent writer, and yeah, I've done all these books and all this production, I wouldn't call myself world class or anything near it. One of the places where I'm really good is that I'm a decent speaker, public speaker, and what that has meant is that The worst case I've ever had was I was at an awards show and suddenly they're introducing the next speaker on stage. And I realize as the music starts, the speaker's going to walk to the stage. Shit, that's me. I was going to hand out an award and give a 1 minute intro speech to that award, and I'd forgotten all about it. So I walk up there and I give the speech, and people clap. And afterwards, there are people saying, "Oh, Klaus, that was a really, really good speech. You can tell that you've prepared that for a long while. You really worked hard on that speech."
Yes.
And of course, since these days I'm not an idiot, except on podcasts, I say, "Yeah, I really put a lot of effort into that." While the harsh truth is, yes, I've been doing this sort of thing for years and years and years and years. So even my worst or even my bad, because I'm at least sober, that is pretty good. Even my 15-second preparation is still enough for level 20.
Right. So your level of unpreparedness at let's call it expert level in general would be different than someone else's level of unpreparedness if they've never spoken publicly.
Yes, exactly.
Because you had some experiences to draw on. You're quick on your feet. You're verbose, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's really hard to measure sort of the good enough. Interesting. As we start to wrap here, Klaus, give me a couple of other thoughts on where you've been able or how you've been able to really effectively use content, because we've talked about pulling back and not being the perfectionist, but where are the places that you go all in and say, I'm level 56 and this needs to be at 56, maybe even pushing 58, like just my best ever in this domain,
Sure.
and it's justified because of A, B, and C.
A couple of places. One is when it matters to you yourself in a subjective way. When you want to prove something to yourself, when you want to prove I could do the thing.
Okay.
Not because of other people, but because of you. Because when you're competing against yourself, you know whether you're level 56 or level 17 or whatever it is. So if you're competing against yourself and you want to do as good as you can, then it doesn't cut it just kind of lazing it and getting a level 20 result. So that's one place, is when you're competing against yourself. And the second is when you're competing against people who you need to blow away.
So a high stakes situation.
Yeah, a high stakes thing. Even I will say that if somebody actually puts me on an actual TED stage and not just the TEDx I've done already, then even I would probably prepare a bit.
Right. Okay. So high stakes. So I think to me, what I heard was there's a high stakes piece. If it's really important, then put the work in, right? If it could be a game changer, career changer,
Yeah.
or it's important to you to be able to know your best. And even, I've had plenty of clients and colleagues that are speakers that walk off a stage with a standing ovation. You get to the back of the room and they're miserable, going, "God, I just that was awful." And you're like, "Okay, but you're the only one in the room of 1,000 that thinks so." And it says, "But I know I'm capable of better," right? Like, so I know I was off my game today, and I know I could, even if I got the standing ovation, everybody said I'm great, blah blah blah. So it's interesting.
I know it could have been better.
Yeah.
And I think the hard thing about being a perfectionist is that you're always competing against yourself. Where those of us who are not perfectionists, we do it once in a while for whatever egotistical reasons we have. But most of the time, we compete against the audience. And that's either much easier or much harder, depending on where your actual skill level is.
Love it. Love it. Well, I appreciate you coming on board. I appreciate you sharing really wonderful ways of thinking about things, wonderful ways of framing, when to put the effort in, where to put the effort in, when to start, when to stop. Collaboration, lots of really, really interesting concepts for folks to sort of process and integrate into their own world, their own practices, and their own businesses. So thank you so much for joining us today, Claus.
Thank you.
To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.